In this video, we're going to talk about the basics of importing modules in Python. In Python, there's basically three ways you can import modules. You can just do an import and then the module name, something like this. And now you can reference any of the symbols that are inside the random module. But to do so, you have to reference the random module itself. So for example, if I wanted to use the randint function, I would need to reference the random module like this. The second common way you might see imports in Python is by importing just certain functions or classes from a module. That would look like this. By importing it this way, you've now added randint to your namespace, and you can reference it directly without referencing the module. Both of these are valid ways to do imports in Python. As far as I can tell from the reading that I did, there's really no underlying difference between the two. You might think that the second example where you're importing just a function might be faster because you might think that it's only importing that one thing. But from what I can tell, it really doesn't work that way. Both methods import the whole thing. It's just a question of what the references are going to look like in your namespace. So how you reference it is all that really changes. My personal preference is that if I'm only going to be using one function or class out of a module, I'll typically do the from module import whatever. If I'm not sure what I'm going to be using, or I'm going to be using a bunch of symbols out of a module, then I'll just import the module and then reference it. There is a third way you might see imports done, and this is common. You see this on the internet. You might see something like this. Never do this, ever. This is a terrible practice, probably the worst possible practice there is in Python. And I will give you two reasons, and there's probably more, but I'll give you two definite reasons why you never do this. One, it clutters your namespace. This imports all the symbols from that module into your namespace. So randint is now in there, as is everything else in the random module. This can cause conflicts with variable names. This can cause conflicts with your own functions or classes. But probably the bigger reason you should never do this is it makes it impossible to maintain. If I'm writing a class and I have an import here, and then somewhere in my code I'm going to reference that, when you come along 2 years from now and you're trying to figure out what exactly it is my constructor does, you can reference the random module. You can look up random, look up the API, and you can know what the randint function does. Even if I do it this way, 2 years from now, when you get to this code, you can say randint. Where does randint come from? Just search for it. Oh, it comes from the random module. If you do this, and especially if you have a bunch of them, well, where does Chuckles come from? I don't know. Does it come from Foo? Does it come from Baz? There's no way to know where this came from. So there's no way to know how to find any documentation about it. It makes it impossible to maintain. So whatever you do, never do this, ever. Something else to consider is what PEP8 has to say about imports from a style perspective. Imports should be on separate lines. You can have multiple imports for one module, like if you're going to import multiple functions from a module, those can be in a comma separated list on one line. But you should separate your module imports, one module per line. You should have your standard library imports first, your related third-party imports, and then your local imports come third. And as I mentioned in the Hangman tutorial, I prefer to, within those groups, have my imports alphabetized. Importing in Python is actually fairly complex. And if you want more information, please check the links below. But I will talk about one more thing, and that's using the importlib module in the interpreter, which can be very useful. So let's say you are writing your own class over here. And it does something. And you come over here and you're testing it. But then you want to make changes to the class and test it again. Well, normally you have to quit the interpreter and you lose whatever symbols you got going on over there, whatever things you may have, variables you've already created, and you got to recreate all of them or other imports, whatever you've been doing over here in the interpreter. Instead, you can import the import lib and you can reload modules you've already loaded. Now this f variable that I've already created hasn't changed. f.foo is still going to give me 4. So I would have to create a new one. But now it's 6. So it reflects the change. Python also has things called relative imports. I'm not going to go into that either. Normally you're not going to use those. You're going to use either import foo or from foo, import foo. Again, there'll be links below if you want to get into more details about how Python does imports.